Who is ERAM? Thank you so much for watching this video. And now back to this channel's Nightmare presentation. ERAM. Coming straight from your gaming device. She's the one. The Queen of Soul. She's creepy and never icy. You can't get this from an egg. Well, the egg probably got it from her. She hurts you through the screen. She's the demon that makes you scream. Say it with her, folks. Nightmare the Demon's Theory time!
Oh, sorry, I don't know what just came over me. Hello there. So, a month or two ago, I released a video in which I sought to discover the identity of the Shadow Mantle Holder of Deltarune Chapter 3. That video received a lot of attention, and as such, I had a lot of comments giving me their own thoughts, or talking about places where they thought my theory fell short. In this video, I aim to address everything that was brought up in the comments, as well as make some amendments myself, to ensure that this theory is as airtight as it can be. Before that though, let me summarise the first part of this theory, for anyone who hasn't watched it, or just needs a refresher. If you haven't watched it, then I heavily suggest that you do so first, in order to gain a fuller understanding of which parts of the theory are backed by a lot of evidence, and which parts are a bit more speculative. You can find the first part in a card that should be showing up in the top right corner right about now. With that being said, let's get into it. The Shadow Mantle Holder in Chapter 3 Sword Root has an ambiguously superior relationship with Kris, is connected with the ever-elusive friend, and is seemingly in control of it, as evident when it summons multiple friends in its boss fight. Not only that, it possesses both knowledge from prior chapters that it shouldn't have if it exists purely within this game, and knowledge of the Weird Route, even if you're not currently on it. This both marks it as a character who may know a similar amount about the story as Ralsei, and a character of significant plot relevance, thanks to the fact that it's superior to Friend, a character who we know is significant to the plot as it is. Coupled with multiple instances of demonic imagery appearing in relation to it, the fact that it appears to live in the shelter, and the fact that Kris is said to have summoned a demon with Catti, I arrived at the conclusion that the Shadow Mantle Holder is a manifestation of this demon. Following this conclusion, I was then able to link the demon to other important ambiguities in the story, mainly other mysterious characters that haunt the narrative, like Spamton's benefactor, the voice that disrupts the Chapter 1 Goner sequence, and the Chapter 4 cooler. Not only that, but there is also evidence to suggest that the demon is linked to the disappearance of December Holiday and that whole plotline. If these all in fact lead back to one key player, this places the Shadow Mantle Holder in a pivotal antagonistic role, and could suggest it to be a major endgame boss, or perhaps even the final boss of Deltarune. Now, if any of that feels far-fetched or confusing, I implore you once again to watch the original video. However, if you feel you have a good enough understanding of my ideas so far, the rest of this video aims to dispel any remaining doubts you may have about the conclusion. The video will be split into 5 main sections: corrections and clarifications, common misconceptions with the first video, counter-evidence that people brought up, some new points and evidence that I'd like to make, and a conclusion with my closing thoughts on the theory. With that said, let's get stuck in, why don't we? Now, I would like to start by making something clear. The community at large, myself included, has been calling the Shadow Mantle Holder ERAM in relation to this song that is linked to it. However, this is not its official name, but merely what the community has chosen to call them. This, in my opinion, has led to a few people giving the word ERAM a bit too much weight. I am therefore making the decision to refer to the Shadow Mantle Holder, the demon, as Nightmare going forward. This is because there have been some recent discoveries in the code that suggest this to be the Mantle Holder's internal name. As well as this, the name feels suitable for a few other reasons that will become clear as the video progresses. I suggest therefore that we as a community adopt the name Nightmare going forward until we have an official name. Likewise, though this is going to be a bit of a harder sell for you, I'm going to be calling the Weird Route the Forbidden Route throughout the video, as the first mention that we have in the game of a secret route is in the Mantle game, where it is called the Forbidden Path. I'm not expecting this to catch on or anything, but it just makes sense to me that we call it what it's been officially referred to as now that we've finally been given such a name. As well as that, the Weird Route, in my opinion, undersells the content of the route in a way that the Forbidden Route really doesn't. It just feels like a more appropriate name overall. With that out of the way, let me quickly address a couple of things that I either failed to convey or just missed in the last video. Number 1, Friend is the tale of hell. I briefly mentioned it in a text wall, but I still got some comments about it, so let's clear this up here. The predominant theory about the Tale of Hell prophecy is that since the tale seems to be made of circles, like the cats in Noel's Cat Petters game which was mentioned in the sweepstakes, the tale is likely referring to Friend and not Nightmare as I claimed. Out of everything that I said in the last video, this is one thing that I will 100% retract, because I do believe the evidence swings more in Friend's favour. However, does this make the Tale of Hell irrelevant to Nightmare? No, I don't think it does. I mean, Nightmare literally summons dozens of friends in their fight, so I'm more willing to believe that Friend is an extension of Nightmare's will. In fact, I believe that they may even be facets of the same character. There is a mountain of evidence you can find about Friend on the internet that implies it to be an important piece of Deltarune's story, and the fact that it is summoned as a mere pawn in Nightmare's fight, to me proves even further that Nightmare is going to be very relevant to both Friend and the Depths, and therefore Deltarune by extension. Number 2, Tenor might be real in the Mantle game. A lot of people brought up Tenor's altered dialogue in his fight if you complete the sword route, which is a fair point to make because if his dialogue changes, that implies that he witnessed something, right? However, it still leaves me baffled as to the nature of Tenor's appearance in the games. Why is he logging onto this old game just to talk to himself in the dark? It doesn't look like he's looking for Kris because he's surprised when they appear. Is he hiding here? Is he still searching for the fun gang? I don't get it, Tenor. What's your goal here, mate? Personally, his presence only makes logical sense if it's more of a metaphorical one, as I mentioned in the original video. Number 3, the character behind the curtain is the cactus that loves Kris. Many of you pointed out to me that this cactus is the one behind the curtain, as it gets upset with you flirting with a water cooler, gives you Saber 10, and acts altogether quite tsundere. I didn't pick up on this, but it makes a lot of sense. Number 4, some of the religious imagery, particularly the Hamza stuff. I had a few people in the comments more knowledgeable than me clarify that the Hamza is more of a cultural symbol rather than connected to any one religion. Furthermore, the charm I showed in the video won't actually protect you from the evil eye, and in fact, using the Hamza thinking it would protect you is something known as shirk, which is a very bad sin in Islam. I have since done more research and clarified this myself. I apologise for the mistake here. The religious connotations were merely supporting evidence, and the imagery remains pretty much as I explained it, so this doesn't change the theory all that much. We will be looking a little more at religious imagery later on. And number 5, in the last video, I said this about nihilism. Your choices don't matter. One of the main types of people that I hear use this phrase are nihilists. This isn't really true, and I simply misremembered my philosophies when I said this. In fact, many nihilists will argue that in the absence of a higher power and inherent meaning to life, we as humans should create meaning in our own lives for ourselves. Fatalism is the word I should have used, which is the philosophy that all events in life are predetermined and therefore inevitable. This is more in line with how Rousey and the prophecies are presented in Deltarune. I would like to address some common misconceptions from people that seem to have misinterpreted some of the things I said in the original video. Number 1. If the knight isn't Des, then the theory is dead. I saw this being said a fair bit in the comments. It's not true. As I mentioned in the video, the knight's identity is not fundamental to nightmares. If it ends up being Carol or Rudy or Azrael, then that doesn't really mean anything towards Nightmare being a demon, and in some cases might even enforce the idea. However, since I do believe that Des being the knight would be the best use of her as a character and would suit the story very well, I decided to discuss the theory under that lens. And if the knight is Papyrus, I will learn how to bake a cake just so that I can make a papyrus cake and smash my head into it, because it's not going to happen. Number 2. There are people that are still claiming that the Shadow Mantle and Nightmare could be the same entity, and I just do not think this is the case. This voice line from Nightmare before its fight proves it. The Shadow Mantle is discussed very differently than Jevil and Spamton's items, which they ostensibly become and do not ever claim to hold. In Jevil's case particularly, we can quite clearly see the difference, as when obtaining the Devil's Knife, which we see him transform into in the fight, he says, "Take me and do your best," while he says, "Take this and do your best," when obtaining the Jevil's Tail, the thing he does not become. Even if they were one and the same, I'm not sure that even disproves anything either. So what if the demon is manifested into the form of the Shadow Mantle? It's still a demon. Number 3, Nightmare is not the only thing in the game that damages the soul. Everything does. This was a common thing that I saw in the comments. Again, it's not true. Some of you pointed out that when the game starts, the soul is loaded into it and Kris's character covers it up. It was suggested that, in fact, everything in the game hurts the soul. This is not what I was referring to. When you fight Nightmare specifically, Kris's physical body is damaged, as evidenced by the damage numbers that don't show up when hit by anything else. This furthers the claim that the presence of Nightmare is the reason why the game's relationship with reality is made nebulous, as you are able to physically enter the game. This further connects Nightmare with the supernatural. These misconceptions have led to some attempts to counter my theory, which I certainly understand in cases like the confusion around the Shadow Mantle being an item, but on the whole these were largely easy to disprove. There was a lot of counter evidence, however, that took a bit more thinking for me to combat. One of the main kinds of counter evidence I received was that of people suggesting alternative ideas for Nightmare's identity. Among those candidates was RAM, from a very determined few. But to talk about RAM, I first need to bring this up. To the 1 billion people that told me that ERAM backwards is meh. I know. This by itself isn't exactly counter-evidence. In fact, I don't know if it really counts as evidence for anything, but I'm gonna put it here anyway. To be honest, this point confuses me a bit. I mean, I'm not sure it's really that relevant. My problem with this very frequently brought up fact is, why would this song name be so specific in referencing Nightmare's true name backwards? Surely, if that was all that ERAM meant, Toby Fox would just call the song Mare instead. I didn't buy it, and neither did some of my commenters, because I learnt from them a harrowing fact. This comment from Omar Sireliev, 34? I don't know if those accents are decorative or not, please forgive me if I'm wrong. This commenter explains it best. ERAM is a rarely used Game Boy function that repeats large chunks of memory, which is usually used to go out of bounds in games, but is often done incorrectly. And what do you do in most of the S-rank game rooms? That's right, you go out of bounds. Now, I wasn't able to personally verify the truthfulness of this comment. I really tried my best. I scoured the internet and I couldn't find anyone saying the same thing exactly. So, anyone in the comments who is more knowledgeable than me about Game Boy functions and RAM in general, feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments section. However, it all makes a lot of sense. This could mean a few things, but at the very least, it is a direct connection to old games consoles, which is a lot more of a compelling connection than some weird rearrangement of this random song title, referencing the word nightmare, random mythological creatures, or the fact that female horses are called mares. However, if it does mean mare, this would be more evidence to support that its real name is Nightmare. Now, admittedly, I did just give RAM Nightmare truthers a bit more ammunition because ERAM is short for Extension RAM or Extended RAM. And it does sound like it could potentially be referencing RAM, right? You could make the argument that Nightmare is an extension of RAM, hence ERAM. RAM's whole deal is self-sacrifice for Kris's sake, and giving Kris the Shadow Mantle could be a form of that. Even though RAM is turned to stone by the end of the Mantle segment, he's still able to disappear from the room even before you fight Nightmare, or before you defeat them. However, despite all of this circumstantial evidence, I don't think this changes the fact that RAM is turned to stone. This would indicate that he has fulfilled his purpose and is no longer a player in this dark world. To me, all of this could indicate that RAM has been coerced in some way by Nightmare in order to guide Kris towards the Mantle games. I just don't think RAM as a character fits in this role. Nightmare is a malicious character, whereas every single character who talks about RAM talks about how his only care in the world was making sure that Kris was happy. Nightmare seems to run in parallel to this by trying to turn Kris towards anger and seems to be a lot more harsh towards them. RAM just would not do this. As well as RAM, the main counter-evidence for this theory that I saw is many people falling under the belief that Nightmare is in fact connected to Ice-E. Okay, let me speedrun their talking points first before I try to counter them. Number 1, the Spamton sweepstakes page. This is a post of a supposed Ice-E spotting written by Noelle as a child. In it she claims that she saw Ice-E on a pizza box winking at her. This is now in reference to Rousey's dialogue at the beginning of chapter 3 about how in darkness things seem to appear differently. She then goes on to describe how Kris burned the eyes out of the box in order to scare her. This is very similar to the name of the track that plays when you fight Nightmare, Burning Eyes. People have suggested that this is why Nightmare has its dark appearance and orange mouth. In Undertale, if you get the fun value 56 or 57, it makes the word Nightmare appear on the word search. This could be both in reference to its internal name, but also people have linked it to the fact that ERAM backwards is mare. Icy-'s mouth also kind of looks like Nightmare's, and Icy in the name could be in reference to the ice magic that Noelle uses. Now, firstly, to counter the smaller points, Nightmare is as connected to Kris, if not more so connected to Kris, than they are connected to Noelle. I'd put less emphasis on the connection to ice magic and more on the connection to the fire magic when we're talking about Nightmare, particularly since this seems to bring Nightmare's relationship to the rest of the Dreamers and to Rousey into more of an open light. The Dreamers and Rousey, of course, are goats, which is another connection to hellish/demonic imagery. Now, as to Spamton sweepstakes, I see this post being brought up as the main thing that people are using to prove that Nightmare is connected to Icy. And this is where I have a bit of an issue with this. I don't think Spamton sweepstakes should be used as primary evidence when we're talking about major characters in the narrative. When we're discussing these characters, it is my opinion that assertions like this need to be backed primarily with evidence that you can find in the game. Supplementary material like Spamton sweepstakes is just that, supplementary. While this post does have some compelling connections to Nightmare and may imply some sort of connection to the Roots prophecy or friend due to this taking place in the forest, I do not believe that it is enough to suggest that Nightmare is Icy or this pizza box. What this post does do for me is enforce the connection that Nightmare has to fear. It also connects the forest to fear even further. It has the shelter in it, and whatever traumatic event Kris experiences is directly linked with the forest and the shelter. This is just yet another event that has instilled fear in someone taking place in the forest. So what does this Ice-E connection to Nightmare mean then? I would say that rather than taking it literally, we should interpolate the fact that Icy's perception of something that instills fear links to Nightmare and its seeming flair for instilling fear as well. What this proves to me is that the pizza box incident in some way is linked to how Nightmare developed its goal of using Noelle and Kris in the Forbidden Route, since the blog post features them both heavily, as well as Des, who under this theory went missing because of Nightmare as well. As for the mouth thing, I don't buy it. I mean, Shawm's mouth looks quite similar, and they're not Nightmare, right? Right? Shawm and Nightmare have a very interesting relationship, and I can see why a lot of people have said that Shawm might even be Nightmare. Let's go through it. Some people have claimed that Nightmare could very well be the Shawm that is on Asriel's computer. Now, this is separate from the Shawm that is in Castletown, and they would in fact be facets of the same character. They are linked in quite a few ways. They are both related heavily to shadow crystals and, of course, the Shadow Mantle. Shawm also acts as a potential foil to Nightmare and vice versa. One gives out shadow crystals, while the other collects them. Not only that, but Shawm is one of the only other characters to use orange so heavily in their colour scheme. Shawm is also one of the only other members of the club of characters that knows a lot more about the story than it seems like they should. The only other two characters being Rousey and, of course, Nightmare. While I think their similarities are very interesting, I don't think they are the same character though. Shawm wants to give Kris the Shadow Mantle, but can't find it. If Nightmare is another version of Shawm, why wouldn't they also give Kris the Shadow Mantle? Nightmare also seems to be disapproving of Kris's collection of the Shadow Crystals, while Shawm actively encourages it. Nevertheless, perhaps in some cruel twist of fate, even though they are so opposed in some areas, they are after the same thing. Shawm requires the Shadow Crystals to make something, and was in possession of the Shadow Mantle. Though it was stolen from Shawm, Nightmare gives it back to Kris after seemingly taking it from King, under this theory's circumstances at least. This implies whatever the Knight does is unrelated to Nightmare's goals. Perhaps Nightmare doesn't outright give Kris the Shadow Mantle and Shadow Crystals because they are trying to test the new soul to see if it is capable of handling these items. No matter how Shawm or Nightmare differ, they both seem to want the same thing from Kris and the soul at the end of the day: to obtain the Shadow Mantle and seemingly use it to take down the Knight. And that about covers all the counter-evidence I've come across that felt worth talking about. Now we really get to the big stuff. All the new evidence that I've come across since the last video. This is all evidence that I feel substantiates all of the main claims that I have made throughout these two videos. Namely, Nightmare's connection to the Shadow Crystals and their holders, particularly Spamton, its role as a major antagonist, and its involvement in the Forbidden Route. So let's start with something that a lot of people asked me about in the comments. As many people pointed out to me, Burning Eyes has the power of Neo's leitmotif in it. At first, it doesn't really seem like there's an explanation why. I mean, what about Nightmare could even remotely connect it to that motif? Well, there is only one other character in Deltarune with the Neo motif, and that is Spamton. Not only that, but Spamton and Nightmare are eerily connected in a lot of other strange ways as well. Most obviously, Spamton's glasses reflect the colours of Friend's eyes. He's also heavily involved with the Forbidden Root, which, as we know, Nightmare is also very connected to, since its role in the Mantle game is so substantial, and that game's whole purpose is to foreshadow the Forbidden Root. Spamton's first phone call with his benefactor is also supposed to have taken place in the Z-Rank room, which has a manhole cover that links it to the Mantle game room. And of course, the controller that you play the Mantle game with is an off-brand controller with yellow and pink buttons. This is once more in reference to Friend, but it also connects to the way that Spamton scams you with bootlegged versions of other items in Chapter 2. It's also pertinent that right before you enter the shelter, you go through a lengthy sequence where Tenor details Spamton's sudden departure and becoming a big shot. With everything in the Mantle game existing to seed the Forbidden Root, this is further evidence that there is an important connection between Nightmare and Spamton here. This sharing of the Neo motif, a symbol of will in the face of an inimitable threat in Undertale, is therefore very interesting here. Of course, we all thought it was simply included in Big Shot because Spamton was using Metaton's Neo body, and of course that is still true. But now it seems to run a little deeper. If we take the Neo motif to imply what it originally did in Undertale, will, determination, in Spamton's context, it could symbolise the will he has to break his puppet strings. The Neo motif in Burning Eyes, however, is short and fleeting, so much so that you might miss it or question its authenticity as a motif, but it's undoubtedly there, and directly ties Nightmare to Spamton in yet another way. Could this perhaps be a sign of Nightmare's will overriding Spamton's? Could Nightmare even be Spamton's puppeteer? This is something I lightly touched on in the original video, but actually on reflection should be looked into more. If Nightmare has caught Kris in a deal, and Spamton and Kris relate to each other due to encouraging them to break their strings, could that connection be more implicit than we thought? Could Spamton's deal with this mysterious cooler have actually been a deal with Nightmare, culminating in his becoming a puppet to Nightmare, taking a Shadow Crystal and being entrusted with Nightmare's Thorn Ring? Another plausible explanation would also be that it was in fact Friend that took the calls, since the Addisons explained that there was nothing but garbage noise on the line after they picked up the phone, and the Gaster sound effect that comes out of Kris's phone when using it in the Dark World is explained in the same way. You could suggest that this is the sound of the depths, a place where Gaster and Friend both reside. As Nightmare and Friend are inextricably linked, this would not change the outcome too much, since Friend seems to be subordinate to Nightmare. Before I continue further, let me just confirm what the Depths is and how it is relevant to those unfamiliar. The Depths of Deltarune is somewhere that seems to sit on a layer of darkness below the Dark Worlds, potentially the place that Gaster was sent to in Undertale's entry number 17.
Dark, darker yet darker, the darkness keeps growing, the shadows cutting deeper, photon readings negative. This next experiment seems very, very interesting. What do you two think?
People have concluded that Friend also exists here too, as well as December Holiday. There are a few lines of dialogue in the code of every chapter of the game where a voice, presumably Des, talks about being trapped in a place that is dark.
Where am I? It's dark. It's so dark here. It's so quiet here, and yet sometimes I swear I hear something. Something like scratching.
This scratching may very well be Friend. Interestingly, this same voice manages to channel itself through Spamton very briefly in his shop. If you select the fear option, very pertinent considering Nightmare's connection to the concept of fear, he'll say,
"According to Encyclopedia of Being Afraid, there's nothing to fear except..."
Can anyone hear me? Help.
Huh? What? No, I didn't hear anything just now. But it sounded like they were talking to you.
Yet another addition to the extensive collection of ways that Spamton is connected to Friend and Nightmare. Extremely interesting. All of this to say, if Gaster and Friend both coexist in the depths, as has been suggested, and that Nightmare is able to summon Friend at will in the Mantle game and is seemingly connected to Des' disappearance, this implies to me that Nightmare also resides in this place. Consider further the fact that the shelter emits a sped up version of the same garbage noise sound, as well as the fact that this is where we fight Nightmare in the Mantle game, and you've got a pretty firm foundation for asserting that Nightmare would also share this place with Gaster and Friend, therefore is equally as likely to make the phone call as Friend is. On that note, it's also worth talking about Nightmare and Gaster's connection. Gaster is the person that talks to us at the beginning of chapter 1 and is promptly interrupted by this voice, who in the last video I suggested could very well be Nightmare. Immediately, this sets them up to be opposed to each other. And even if you don't believe that this voice is Nightmare, this is also suggested through how Gaster reacts to Kris obtaining the Shadow Mantle in chapter 3. He rather uncharacteristically interferes with the experiment should you lose the fight against the knight after completing the sword route and obtaining the mantle. This implies that this was an unexpected outcome for Gaster. This suggests that Gaster and Nightmare are not working together, or at the very least that Gaster is unaware of their motivations. Considering that Gaster doesn't even interfere with the forbidden route, this would have to be something completely unforeseen. Are Nightmare and Friend able to completely conceal themselves from Gaster, or was this specific choice to provide Kris with the mantle somehow something uncharacteristic of them? Gaster's connection to the number 666 is also very interesting here, though I'm not completely sure what it might mean in the context of Nightmare. This number, at the very least, proves that they share a similar existence in the depths. Perhaps, if Nightmare is the interrupting voice, they could have potentially stolen the vessel in the Gonamaker sequence. This is very speculative, but it does have a small bit of evidence backing it up. After you finish the sword route, the Dust Bunny will say this. Wait a second, that's funny. Kris, didn't you already go past? Perhaps Nightmare fled using the vessel? I mean, there's not much more that I can say to prove or disprove it, but it is worth suggesting nonetheless. Whew, okay, that was a lot more talk about the depths than I was expecting, so let's move on to something else. There is reason to suggest that the events surrounding the Eggman may also be connected to Nightmare. There have been quite a lot of dedicated theories about the Eggman, so I will summarise all the relevant points here. In chapter 3 and 4, the egg rooms were a lot more substantial and involved Kris a lot more personally, alluding to something perhaps in their past. The Eggman says that Kris has forgotten him before in chapter 3, implying that whatever the Eggman represents is something that Kris wishes not to remember. Chapter 4's egg room takes place in some sort of therapy session, where Kris is asked to draw the subject of the event that they want to forget, represented by the Eggman. Interestingly, they paint over it with a tree, much like the Eggman has been hidden by a tree in all previous rooms. As this egg room appears in the same room the Roots Prophecy and Tale of Hell are mentioned in, and the presence of trees is very frequent, we can link this traumatic event back into the events surrounding December, the forest and the shelter, and therefore, Nightmare. Its inclusion as a prophecy, as well as the story that the organic that's also in the room recites, all seems to suggest that this event is going to be very important, and it connecting to Nightmare makes Nightmare even more important as well. Speaking of Des's disappearance, I think it's time to delve into the holidays some more. During this video, the circumstances between Nightmare, Carol and the Knight have changed. Last time I put forward the idea that the three of them were in collusion together alongside Kris, and that Nightmare was actually the person on the phone with Kris in chapter 4, thanks to the contrast in how they presented in the normal route versus when Carol calls Kris at the end of the forbidden route. Every single character so far has spoken normally while on the phone, so why would Carol's voice suddenly be different here? Simply put, the answer is that it's just not her, despite the circumstantial evidence that backs it up. The presentation of these phone calls would make more sense if it's from a character not contacting us from the light world. This leads into discussion over Carol's connection to Nightmare and how she may be involved. However, in this video I have pointed out that Nightmare may in fact be opposed to the Knight, since they unexpectedly give Kris the Shadow Mantle that we use to fight it. This puts a fair bit of my evidence in jeopardy and makes it a bit more unlikely that Carol is working with both of them. Panicked as I was when writing this script though, there is a solution to this that doesn't complicate things and is consistent with the narrative. This group has a tendency to go behind people's backs. A lot. Kris is in at least 3 different groups that are directly opposed to each other, and they've been keeping very quiet about it. Carol seems to be working with Asgore to accomplish the same thing that her and Kris presumably are, yet Asgore seems to be none the wiser about any of the details. The Knight convinced the main antagonists of the first 3 chapters to help it with its goal without telling them what the consequences would be, and punishing Tenor for deviating. And Nightmare, of course, has already shown malice towards Kris, and as I suspect they are pulling the strings of every factor in this conversation, it is not unreasonable to suggest that they have been able to do exactly what everyone else has been doing, acting secretive, concealing information, and doing whatever they need to do to achieve their own personal goals. I think it may even be deceiving Carol in the same way, with only Kris being more aware of what Nightmare is fully capable of. It is in a demon's nature to lie and manipulate after all, and Carol has plenty of things she could easily be be manipulated for, considering the fact that Nightmare is almost certainly aware of Des's circumstances and whatever role Kris had in it that they are trying so hard to suppress. One thing that I focused on in the original video was the religious imagery that surrounded Nightmare. Since that video, I've been able to make some connections to some other religious imagery. Firstly, in the egg room there is this book that you can read that says, "And so wept the fallen star, making rivers with its tears. Then, slowly, from the bitter water, something grew. It looked like glass." This is an allusion to the Book of Revelation in the Bible. In the excerpt, a star is mentioned, called Wormwood. This star is prophesied to fall onto the earth during the end of days, poisoning a third of its water supply, likely what the glass represents in the Deltarune text. This glass is likely a shadow crystal, and given this book appears in the egg room alongside the Roots prophecy and the guy that talks about the pointed tail, or friend, we can gather that this is also connected to Kris's traumatic event and whatever led to Des's disappearance. Depending on whether you believe it to be Nightmare or the Knight behind the shadow crystals, the fact that it specifically mentions a fallen star is very telling. A fallen star is often interpreted as a fallen angel, in other words, the devil. Yet more evidence to suggest the shadow crystals are something hailing from demonic origins. On the note of angels, let's talk about the Titans imagery some more, because the angelic imagery that Titans possess is evidently a sign of the game blurring the lines on what is angelic and what is demonic, right? However, it is also important to note how angels are depicted in the Bible. I'm sure that everyone knows by now what a biblically accurate angel is, but why are they depicted in this way? Well, angels in the Bible are described to be unfathomably scary. Or rather, the incomprehensible nature of angels is what causes fear in mortals. While demons hide their true nature in order to deceive humans, angels have no need to hide themselves, leaving their infiniteness, their holy nature, completely on display. This is why unholy beings like mortals and, in fact, demons react to angels in abject terror. Holiness is overwhelming, and when we are overwhelmed, we are scared. This paints us to be on the side of demons even more, as Titans are described exactly the same way by Rousey, unfathomably scary, ever present. The song that plays while fighting the Titans is called Guardian, which may reflect that when the darkness grows, their purpose is actually to ward off demons and any who associate with them. They're here to ward off the dark. This doesn't explain why they're incapable of comprehending mercy and why they seek only to destroy, but as I mentioned in the last video, the line between demons and angels is being deliberately blurred here through the portrayal of the Titans, the seeming doom behind the angels' heaven, and Noelle being so concretely tied to Friend and Nightmare despite being primarily associated with angels herself. Whatever the case, it is clear that destruction is not all there is to these Titans. They serve to protect something, be that good or bad. And finally, the theory thus far concludes that Nightmare is a demon that was summoned by Kris and Catti. We've gotten that far. However, the nature of this demon, whether they're a literal one or a darkener born out of the summoning, is something that at this stage we can reasonably have different interpretations of and have the theory still work. I don't think this is something that we either have the information nor the need to clarify. That being said, after watching this brilliant theory by Nighthawk, something clicked. A hypothetical that made everything slot together. Many have suggested that Nightmare is some sort of darkener, but something has forever bothered me about these assertions. Nightmare is just too important and overreaching to be a mere household object. They've got to be something bigger. This is a more speculative idea, but this theory supposits that since Rousey and Nightmare both break the fundamental rules of being darkness in similar ways, being able to freely move around between dark worlds and knowing things they shouldn't, they must be special darkness that aren't bound to such rules. As a result, this theory suggests that they are darkness created out of concept, out of an idea. This really clicked with me, not least because it finally gives a satisfying explanation for why Nightmare is connected to this icy sweepstakes post. Nightmare is not the icy pizza box, but they were shaped by the events that this post details. It has been established that darkness can have their personalities somewhat imposed onto them by lightness, and this pizza box incident mainly establishes the precedent that Kris often scares Noelle. So, as Nightmare is an entity representative of fear itself, we can assume that this incident marked somewhat of a beginning for Nightmare's existence in the consciousness of the Lightners. But okay, maybe this is still a bit vague. We'd still need some sort of explanation for why it would be connected to Kris specifically, right? Nighthawk suggests that Nightmare is in fact Noelle's Darkener, but I disagree. Nightmare is inextricably linked to Kris for all of the reasons I've listed in this theory. So what could we use that could tie the idea of a sort of metaphysical Darkener to Kris specifically? That is where the demon summoning comes back into things. One thing I have wondered about is the fact that this demon summoning is nothing but a rumour throughout the town. Surely if it worked, which we're assuming it did, more would know. Even Catti seems to not be at all concerned, considering she helped summon the damn thing. Well, if Nightmare is indeed a Darkener of Kris's creation, here is my theory that ties everything we've talked about today together. It is pretty clear that if Nightmare is a demon, it is Kris's demon. Catti, of course, is very into the occult, but this demon summoning seems to be Kris's only significant venture into that field. I would wager that should Nightmare be linked to the traumatic event Kris experienced, that the demon summoning either was linked to said event as well, or was said event. What if Nightmare was born out of the demon summoning due to Kris's sheer level of fear they were experiencing at that point in their life? If the demon summoning was an opportunity for such a specific kind of fear to take form as a Darkener, then that would explain why it's only tied itself to Kris and why Catti is none the wiser. As we've discussed, Kris's own past is something that they're scared of, likely because of how they are tied to Des's disappearance, so it is natural to conclude one of two things. Either that Des's disappearance was what imposed this personality onto Nightmare, or that Nightmare being this way is what caused the Des incident. Whatever the case, this chain of events may very well have been what caused Nightmare's creation, or at the very least, what drew them towards Kris. They have since been powerless to stop Nightmare, losing their autonomy in several overlapping circumstances, likely as a direct result of Nightmare. Deltarune is not a game about choices. They have a large role in the narrative, of course, but there is something else that haunts this game's themes, and has done since the very start. It has been terrorizing Hometown for a long time already, and has taken things from many people. Family members, jobs, autonomy, and even now seems not to be satisfied. In fact, it seems to be focused on Noelle and Kris specially, attempting to lead them down a forbidden path that will bring them and everyone around them suffering and terror that was never before imaginable. It exists in many places, through entities that exist as a part of itself. Friends, this entity has caused Noelle a lot of trouble in the past, and in the present day exists in the shadows, watching every action that Kris takes. No matter which route we choose, whatever actions we perform, one thing sits above it all, driving everything forward. Because Deltarune is not a game about choices. Deltarune is a game about fear. The fear of being outcast, the fear of loss, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of the past, the fear of what is yet to come, the fear of death, the fear of the unknown. But most of all, it is a story about overcoming that fear. And what better antagonist to overcome in a story about fear than the embodiment of fear itself? Right then. So, where does this leave us? Well, if there's anything I want you to take away from this video, it would be this. Nightmare and Friend are likely facets of the same character. Anything we learn about Friend will likely apply to Nightmare too. With that in mind, Kris's complete lack of autonomy mirroring Spamton's is likely the case because of the fact that they have both accepted deals with the devil with Friend/Nightmare. Not only that, but it is almost with certainty that I can say that Nightmare plays a pivotal part in Des's disappearance, and that this event is linked to Kris's trauma that the egg rooms represent. It is therefore unavoidable that Nightmare will appear in Deltarune's ending as a significant antagonist. And this remains true even if you disagree with some or even a lot of my theory. I truly think that if you're with me on any of the worlds that I've created around this theory, you have to admit that Nightmare is going to be the main thing that ties most of the narrative's loose ends together. So yeah, I think this video will be the last one that I post on this topic for now, but I will still fight for the theory in the comments of this video and wherever else my input might be relevant. Nightmare and Friends seem to finally be entering the wider mainstream in terms of Deltarune discussion, so there have been a lot more differing opinions on their role and purpose in the narrative circling the internet, which is great. I released the first video at a time where pretty much no one was talking about it, and I think it was the only video on the subject for a good few weeks. So I'm really glad that people have started finally taking note of the character's significance. I mentioned Nighthawk's video, of course, but there have been so many since I uploaded that last video that have just been incredible. In particular, a few days before I recorded this footage, there was a really great video released by Seek about the character Mike, which basically concluded that the character that Tenor and Spamton had been referring to as Mike is actually Friend. It's a great video and I'm fully on board with it because it largely fits into my theories perfectly. I mean, it brings up many of the same points that I use to justify Nightmare and Friends connections to people like Spamton particularly. I bring this up because they're currently working on another video that ties Nightmare into Friend and Mike, which, by the way, if you need anyone to bounce ideas off Seek, I've literally been analysing this character for the last 3 months straight, so I'd love to get in touch. In any case, this is evidence that Nightmare significance is finally starting to catch on. And if I've in any way contributed to raising awareness, regardless of how many people actually agree with me, then I see that as a real success. Over the last few months, I've been analysing this game non-stop, so I have a lot more that I would love to talk about in terms of other theories and analysis. There's a particular video I have in mind about Tenor and Spamton's ambiguous partnership and what that could mean, and I've always thought that Undertale Yellow deserved a full-length video essay made about it. But I'm completely open to hearing what you guys would like to hear me talk about. On that note, I finally opened a Discord server, which you can join by clicking the link in the description or in my channel bio. Over there I'll be doing various things like running a poll to gauge what people want to see and discussing the theory with anyone that wants to. Also, if enough of you want to become channel members for just £1 a month, then I'll open a members only channel. There you'll be able to access early drafts of my projects, you'll be able to give feedback on my stuff, and generally just hang out. So if you want to talk about Deltarune or anything else that I make videos about, or just games in general, then feel free to come and join. That being said, as was probably evident by the gap between this video and the last one, I'm gonna have to slow down on the uploads for a bit. As I mentioned in the Silksong video, university started taking up a lot more of my time, so I don't really have as much time to edit and write these really long scripts. In fact, if it weren't for my friend Dan, who really generously volunteered to edit most of this video, aside from the introduction and what I'm filming right now, this video probably wouldn't have seen the light of day for a good few months. So I'm really thankful for him offering to help out. If you want to check him out, I've linked a video where I play Minecraft with him on his channel in the description. However, even though these big uploads will be slowing down for a while, I'm still going to be streaming at least once a week on the weekends, as I've been doing for the last few weeks. So if you want to see me play Silksong before I play Hollow Knight, if you want to see me record footage for Undertale Yellow perhaps, or if you want to see me do things with my friends, then feel free to head on over to my streams, or you can subscribe so that you don't miss the highlights. Alright, that's about it. If you stuck to the end, comment I'm old again. That was fun last time, wasn't it? Right, that's it. Appreciate you. Toodaloo.